Before you watch this video, I just want to make sure you're aware that this is a compilation of the Neanderthal series that I have recently finished on the channel. I've chopped and changed some parts of the videos to try and make it a full documentary and not just a compilation. If you've already watched the previous 4 videos, then you will have already seen all the content in this video. Thank you and enjoy. If you are familiar with prehistory, then you are aware of just how advanced Neanderthals were. But the majority of people view Neanderthals as primitive ancestors, incapable of self-expression. This, of course, is false. The first glimpse of Neanderthal expression comes in the form of cave art. Researchers use uranium-thorium dating to investigate cave art from 3 previously discovered sites in Spain. In La Pasiega in northern Spain, researchers found that a red linear motif is more than 64,000 years old. In Ardales, southern Spain, various red painted stalagmite formations date to different episodes of painting, including one between 45,300 and 48,700 years ago, and another before 65,500 years ago. In Moltravieso in western central Spain, researchers found that the red hand stencil is older than 66.7 thousand years. These results demonstrate that cave art was being created in all 3 sites at least 20,000 years prior to the arrival of Homo sapiens in Western Europe. They show for the first time that Neanderthals did produce cave art and that it was not a one-off event. It was created in caves across the full stretch of Spain, and at the Ardales, it occurred at multiple times over at least an 18,000 year period. The types of paintings produced are also found in caves elsewhere in Europe, so it could be the case that some of these were made by Neanderthals too. It's near enough impossible to interpret the meaning of these paintings, but we do know they must have been important to Neanderthals. Some of the paintings were located in pitch black areas deep in the caves, requiring the preparation of a light source as well as the pigment. The locations appear deliberately selected, the ceilings of low overhangs or impressive stalagmite formations. These must have been meaningful symbols in meaningful places. Neanderthal cave art seems to have different characteristics than the Homo sapien cave art made 20,000 years later. Neanderthal cave art seems to be more abstract. Symbols like the ladder, handprints, and random patterns differ from our early paintings. The oldest known cave art is the Moltravieso cave art in Spain, which is a series of various hand stencils dating to 64,000 years ago. The oldest Homo sapiens in Africa began showing artistic signs between 70 and 100,000 years ago. But we seem to stick with a particular theme: figurative art. In fact, we don't start to see symbolic cave art in Homo sapiens until thousands of years after the Neanderthal symbolic paintings. What's also fascinating is that we have no confirmed instances of Neanderthals creating figurative art. If this is true, and Neanderthals never made figurative art, then why? Why did we decide to paint what we see when Neanderthals were painting images that are impossible to interpret? Perhaps when Homo sapiens entered Europe, we mixed with Neanderthal culture, learning their art and symbolic references, and then carrying on this culture and moulding it into our own thousands of years after their extinction. Neanderthal art didn't just stop at these wonderful cave paintings. They also decorated their bodies with jewellery. A team of scientists released a study of 8 prehistoric eagle talons that were found to have deliberate cut markings, indicating that they were once strung together as a necklace or bracelet. The talons were found in a cave in Croatia that housed Neanderthals for thousands of years. Though the talons had been previously examined, when scientists examined them for a second time, they noticed the carvings dating back to 130,000 years ago, 80,000 years prior to the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe. A few talons and feathers, also bearing hints of use as jewellery, have been discovered in other Neanderthal sites, but this collection of 8 talons from at least 3 different birds is the largest and oldest on record. Some of the cut marks, presumably made when the talons were severed from the bird's legs, were smoothed over. Many of the talons are also polished. This is clear evidence that Neanderthals manipulated the claws for use as jewellery pieces, such as necklaces or pendants. This also proves that this wasn't only Homo sapiens that possessed minds capable of such symbolic behaviour, expressed in cave art, jewellery, and other artefacts with no obvious practical use. Eagle talons are rare at other Neanderthal localities, and no sites have yielded 8 talons from white-tailed eagles or any other raptor. Since 3 to 4 different eagles are represented, they must have been acquired in separate events and were preserved as a unit before they were lost in the sediments. Others have noted that raptor bones found in late Pleistocene sites signal some kind of symbolic activity. Further evidence for combining these in jewellery is edge smoothing of the cut marks, the small, polished facets, and medial, lateral sheen and nicks on some of the specimens. All are likely manifestations of the separation of the bones from the foot and the attachment of the talons to a string of sinew. Cut marks on many aspects illustrate the numerous approaches the Neanderthals had for severing the bones and mounting them into a piece of jewellery. These talons are the earliest piece of evidence for jewellery in the European fossil record and demonstrate that Neanderthals possess a symbolic culture long before modern humans arrived in Europe. Anthropologist Alison Brooks at George Washington University says Neanderthals were known to use pigments, but crudely, like crayons, and a fascinating Paleolithic site in the Iberian Peninsula highlights this. Dating to as early as 50,000 years ago, pigment-stained marine shells were discovered at the Cueva Anton. At Cueva de los Aviones, 3 umbo-performed valves of Ankythiocardia and Glyciomeris were found alongside lumps of yellow and red colorants. A perforated pecten shell, painted on its external, white side with an orange mix of goethite and hematite, was abandoned after breakage at Cueva Anton, 60 kilometers inland. Comparable early modern human-associated material from Africa and the Middle East is widely accepted as evidence for body ornamentation, implying behavioural modernity. The Iberian finds show that the European Neanderthals were no different from coeval Africans in this regard, countering genetic, cognitive explanations for the emergence of symbolism and strengthening demographic and social ones. It is thought that shells like this were worn symbolically as jewellery. What they actually represented will forever remain unknown. Perhaps jewellery, like the shell and eagle talons, were gifted between tribe members to win over a mate, or worn by the most dominant members of the group. The reason for pigment being used on the body's skin is again unknown, but does highlight a sophisticated, artistic culture among these European dwellers. For centuries, Germany's Unicorn Cave has been a lure for people seeking secrets from the past. In the Middle Ages, people mined the site for mammoth tusks, cave bear teeth, and the remains of other extinct animals. The unfamiliar skeletons were thought to belong to legendary beasts, dragons perhaps. More recently, on a warm summer's day in 2019, Gabriel Rousseau sat outside the Unicorn Cave, marvelling at another mysterious bone in his hand. About the size of a chess piece, it was carved with 10 deep, slanting lines on one side. Rousseau, a University of Tübingen archaeozoologist, immediately recognised it as a phalange, more precisely, the second knuckle bone of a large hooved animal called Megalosaurus. On closer examination, he noticed something odd. The cuts didn't look like the hacking of a butcher trying to extract meat or marrow. These marks appeared intentional, like an abstract pattern or decorative design. Research in and around the cave since 2014 has turned up ample tools and artifacts showing that its caverns were used by early modern humans and their Neanderthal ancestors. The archaeologist assumed the bone was a decorative piece carved by an Ice Age human, not a Neanderthal, and that radiocarbon dating would likely support their assumption. An international team of researchers reported that the radiocarbon dating shows that the carving is at least 51,000 years old, meaning it was created at least 1,000 years before modern humans arrived there. The direct radiocarbon date from the incised bone left no question as to the artifact's age. Researchers also tried to replicate the carvings to ensure that the marks weren't the accidental byproduct of butchering or idle scratches by a bored Neanderthal killing time by the campfire. They determined that the carvings were best replicated on bone that was repeatedly boiled and dried, and then each cut took at least 10 minutes to carve and used up 1 or 2 valuable flint blades, which means a lot of time and effort went into creating it. As anyone familiar with arguments about abstract painting and modern art knows, art is in the eye of the beholder. For many, it's a distinctively modern concept, something with symbolic meaning to the maker and the audience, made to be enjoyed or appreciated for the way it looks. The definition of art can shift from culture to culture, and even decade to decade. That makes it tricky to talk about what Neanderthals were hoping to achieve when they carved a design on one piece of bone. Today, we usually mean art in a visual and aesthetic sense, and we don't know if that's what was meaningful to them. It's difficult to label something made 50,000 years ago with our own concepts. Symbolic expression, on the other hand, is easier to recognise and agree on. From the choice of animal species to the orientation of the cut lines angling upward when you set the bone on its flat, stable end. The ancient carver of the Unicorn Cave bone was making deliberate choices that seem to have had specific meaning. There are some conflicting opinions on if this bone had any practical use. John Shea, an archaeologist at Stony Brook University in New York, suggests that the Unicorn Cave bone could be a sinker for a fishing line, a spool for a thread, or some other utilitarian tool that we're unfamiliar with. He, along with others, argue that just because we can't identify the exact function of the bone doesn't mean we can assume it's symbolic art. He also argues that symbolic art is usually accompanied by similar, if not the same forms of symbols, which we don't necessarily see at the Unicorn Cave. We know from other sites that not only were Neanderthals capable of making symbolic art, but it is characteristic of these ancient humans. This is why many researchers suggest that this knuckle bone is a form of art and not a tool for survival. Once illuminated by the flickering fires of prehistoric builders, an array of mysterious stone circles hid in the darkness for millennia, tucked into the recesses of a cave in France. Now these ancient structures are again emerging from the shadows. Sealed since the Pleistocene, Breniquel Cave is located in southwest France, in a region littered with decorated caves and other Paleolithic sites. In 1990, researchers excavated its entrance and squeezed through, finding signs of long-vanished cave bears and other extinct megafauna just inside. But the cave's real treasure lay in a damp chamber more than 1,000 feet from the entrance. There, several large, layered ring-like structures protruded from the cave floor. The seemingly unmistakable craftwork of builders with a purpose. The mysterious structures are built from nearly 400 staglamites. Hewn to roughly the same length, some of the staglamites were crafted into a large circular structure, measuring nearly 22 feet across. Others were aligned in a smaller semicircle, and the rest were stacked in heaps. Cracked areas of red and black discoloration indicate that fires had been lit atop the staglamites, and charred bits of bone, including the burnt bone of a bear or large herbivore, were found near the smaller circle. Even to a trained eye, the scene looked like it could be the work of early modern humans who first appeared in Europe about 40,000 years ago. But uranium dating of the staglamites, as well as dates for a mineral cloak that had grown over them and the bits of bone, revealed an age the team didn't expect. The strange rings are roughly 176,000 years old. The structures vastly predate the arrival of Homo sapien, not just by a smidge, but by more than 100,000 years. Meaning that they must have been made by Neanderthals, or a very, very late version of Homo heidelbergensis, as they were the only humans known to be in Europe at the time. It's worth noting that Homo heidelbergensis supposedly died out 24,000 years before the date of the structure, and it's thought that European heidelbergensis would eventually evolve into Neanderthals. There have been some points put forwards, claiming that the stone circles may have been unintentionally made by hibernating cave bears, but it's worth noting the presence of fire, which we know bears can't make. If the structures are indeed the work of Neanderthals and not cave bears, their purpose is still a mystery. No one knows what the Neanderthals might have been doing in that cave or how long they used it. One of the archaeologists at the site said that if there is still burnt debris from occupation, it would help us determine whether this was a functional refuge or shelter, perhaps roofed using wood and skins, or something which may have been more symbolic or had a ritual significance. It is possible that Neanderthals believed in spirits and the afterlife. Scientists speculate that Neanderthals possibly buried food and prized items with their dead for their trip to the afterlife, so it's possible that Neanderthals could have built structures with the purpose of serving their obsession with death and ritual. Neanderthals were long thought to be our dim-witted, primitive ancestors. This is changing, with more and more sites, like the ones we discussed, being discovered in the modern day. Who knows what is left out there to be found? It seems now that modernity isn't unique to Homo sapiens, but is also prominent in Neanderthals. With a few exceptions, such as the Schunningen spears and the finds of wooden tools at Pogeti Vecchi, almost all of our knowledge about the Middle Paleolithic comes from durable materials such as bone and stone. We know from observations of our own surroundings that most of the material culture of humans is comprised of perishable materials. Previously, researchers have demonstrated that the microenvironment immediately surrounding a stone tool can preserve microscopic fragments of what is otherwise invisible. This is true for the preservation of a 3-ply string fragment stuck to a stone tool from Abri du Moras, labelled G8128, which demonstrates that the cord is at least contemporary with the deposition and burial of the flake, and is therefore of Middle Paleolithic origin. Examination of photomicrographs revealed 3 bundles of fibre with S-twists, which is when a yarn is spun counterclockwise. which were then plied together with a Z-twist, which is when the yarn is spun clockwise, to form a 3-ply cord. Doing this locks the fibres together and prevents it from unravelling, creating an exponentially stronger material. It's the same engineering we find today with metal cables holding up suspension bridges or rope on sailing ships. The cord is approximately 6.2 millimeters in length and approximately 0.5 millimeters in width. Wood fibres have also been found at the site, some of which show signs of cordage manufacturing, but not sufficient enough to come to a final conclusion. So far, G8128 is the only concrete evidence we have of Neanderthals' use of fibre technology. The cord is not necessarily related to the use of tools. If it was buried at the same time as the flake, it could have been wrapped around it as part of a haft, or could even have been part of a net or bag. Hafting is the process of attaching a tool to a handle or strap, like a stone arrowhead or axe head. Previous analysis of impact fractures on artifacts from the site suggests the use of hafting and provides support for this possibility. If it was deposited before the flake, it could represent a number of different items, but still illustrates the use of fibre technology at the site. In terms of actual preservation of fibre technology, the Upper Paleolithic waterlogged site of Ohalo 2 yielded 3 fragments of fibres with a Z-twist, approximately 19,000 years old. Remnants of a 6-ply cord were found at Lasso and date to approximately 17,000 years old, both of which are attributed to Homo sapiens. The cord fragments from Abri du Moras is older still, dating to between 41 and 52,000 years ago. It appears increasingly likely that fibre technology is much older than previously thought. This discovery is exciting enough, as organic technologies are usually long rotted away. But impressive technology like this also gives us gratifying glimpses into Neanderthal minds. Making strong string is unlikely to have been invented just in that instance by one individual. It's more likely that the community knowledge of the technique was acquired and passed on through imitation or direct instruction from generation to generation. While it is clear that the cord from Abri du Moras demonstrates Neanderthals' ability to manufacture cordage, it hints at a much larger fibre technology. Once the production of a twisted, plied cord has been accomplished, it is possible to manufacture bags, mats, nets, fabric, baskets, structures, snares, and even watercraft. The cord from Abri du Moras likely consists of fibres derived from conifers. The fibrous layer of the inner bark is referred to as bast and eventually hardens to form bark. In order to make cordage, Neanderthals had extensive knowledge of the growth and seasonality of these trees. Bast fibres are easier to separate from the bark and the underlying wood in early spring as the sap begins to rise. Ropes and baskets are central to a large number of human activities. They facilitate the transport and storage of food, aid in the design of tools for fishing, or perhaps used to make objects for recreational means such as dolls for children. The technological and artistic applications of twisted fibre technologies are vast. Once adopted, fibre technology would have been indispensable and would have been a big part of everyday life. Fibre acquisition, processing, and production may have also played an important role in scheduling daily and seasonal activities. Although wooden artifacts are rare, other finds do attest to Neanderthals' detailed knowledge of trees. They chose boxwood for its density and used fire in the production of digging sticks at Pogete Vecchi approximately 175,000 years ago. In the construction of the Schilingen spears, they decentered the point to increase strength. Furthermore, Neanderthals were manufacturing birch bark tar and using it as an adhesive in the Middle Pleistocene of Italy. Based on this evidence, the utilisation of bast fibres from trees is an obvious outcome of their intimate arboreal knowledge. The production of cordage requires an understanding of mathematical concepts and general numeracy in the creation of sets of elements and pairs of numbers to create a structure. Humans have been making stone tools for well over 3.3 million years. Spanning half of this time, stone tools were unsophisticated and were fashioned only when needed. But about 1.5 million years ago, something began to change. Our ancestors started making stone tools that were more standardized, often in the form of teardrop-shaped axes. These tools were labeled Achillean tools, and were both more durable, effective, and versatile than the older one tools. But the innovation of our human ancestors didn't stop there. After the rise of the Achillean industrial era, which spanned over 1 million years, a better, more sophisticated technique was introduced by Neanderthals, called the Levallois technique. Named after the archaeological site outside of Paris where the technique was first recognised and described by archaeologists in the 1860s, the process allows a toolmaker to create a tool of predictable size and shape. For the Levallois technique, the toolmaker takes an oblong, relatively flat, flint nodule and strikes flakes off the thinner side of the core all the way around its circumference. They then flip the nodule over and strike flakes off its front side, then flip it again to do the same on the back. Finally, after a lot of such preparation, the toolmaker strikes one end of the core to remove a large and distinctive Levallois flake. Properly prepared, such a core can yield several flakes of predictable size and shape, all of which can be used as tools. Archaeologists have therefore pointed to its appearance as a watershed moment in human cognition. The degree of foresight and planning required to create a Levallois core is far greater than that required for all previous stone tool technologies, including hand axes. But why is this important? It's important because for the first time we can see our ancestors focused on an abstract concept, a flake of predictable size and shape that did not become clear until the final Levallois flake was removed from the core. The Levallois technique is also associated with two other hominin populations, late Homo heidelbergensis and Homo sapiens. All three species of humans span throughout Asia, North Africa and Europe, and this is where we find the Levallois technique. It's thought, however, that these populations developed this technique independently and was not a result of communication or imitation between species. In Armenia, archaeologists found a series of artifacts preserved in deep layers. The artifacts were dated at 325 to 335,000 years old and were a mix of two distinct stone tool technology traditions, bifacial tools and Levallois tools. Anthropology professor and co-director of the excavations, Daniel Adler, suggests that the coexistence of bifacial and Levallois tools at the site provides the first clear evidence that local populations developed Levallois technology out of existing bifacial technology, and that the artifacts found at the site reflect the technological flexibility and variability of a single population. Whether humans developed this technique independently or not, we will never truly know. But what we do know is that the replacement of bifacial stone tools such as hand axes by tools made from flakes detached from lamellar cores documents the most important conceptual shift in stone tool production strategies since the arrival of bifacial technology more than 1 million years earlier, and as the evidence suggests, it was started by Neanderthals. There is very little doubt that many ancient civilizations had good navigational and sailing skills, given the long history of the sea. Ancient civilizations built several maritime routes and traded goods like spices, gold, silk, and many other commodities after realizing the benefits of trade. With suggestions that Homo erectus conquered the sea, it will come as no surprise to you when I say that Homo sapiens may have not been the first humans to set sail. Currently, the oldest boat to be found is the Pesser canoe, which was found in the Netherlands, dating to roughly 10,000 years old. We find little evidence of boats being used before this because they would have been made from perishable materials like wood and rope. The stone and bone that is so common in the archaeological record wouldn't have been used in a boat's construction. Therefore, we can't necessarily rely on archaeological evidence to back this theory. We must look at other pieces of evidence, like the migration of humans, and take into context what the land would have looked like at the time. Stone tools that are uniquely associated with Neanderthals have been found on islands in the Mediterranean Sea, suggesting that Neanderthals had figured out how to travel by boat. Neanderthals lived around the Mediterranean from 300,000 years ago. Their distinctive Mousterian stone tools are found on the Greek mainland and, unusually, have been also found on the Greek islands of Lefkada, Kefalonia and Zakynthos. The journeys to the Greek islands from the mainland were quite short, 5 to 12 kilometers. But according to Thomas Strasser of Providence College in Rhode Island, the Neanderthals didn't stop there. In 2008, he found similar stone tools on Crete, which he says are at least 130,000 years old. Crete has been an island for roughly 5 million years and is 40 kilometers from its closest neighbor, suggesting a far more ambitious journey. The big question is, how did they get there? That sort of distance wouldn't necessarily require boats to make the journey. The Neanderthals might have just swam across, but that doesn't really take into account the much more distant island of Crete. We can't be certain, but it does seem that Neanderthals did indeed start sailing to the Mediterranean, and quite possibly on a regular basis, 50,000 years before Homo sapiens first conquered the seas. The opposition to this argument is that the tools on the island have not been chemically dated, so estimates of their age are based entirely on their design. When we take into account the use of fibre technology that we mentioned earlier in the video, and the newly discovered 467,000-year-old wooden structure in Zambia that shows signs of a great understanding of carpentry, then I don't think it's outlandish to suggest that Neanderthals made boats to sail the seas. But without any archaeological findings, it will be almost impossible to know for sure. Planet Earth, 400,000 years ago. The planet has just been through various extreme environmental changes. For the past 50,000 years, Northern Europe has been covered in thick ice sheets, spanning the entire width of the continent. But now, things are changing. Temperatures have warmed, and the ice has melted. The sea has risen to present-day levels, but Britain is still connected to Northern Europe by a narrow land bridge. Neanderthals crossed this land bridge and settled in Britain, but they weren't the first humans to do so. 500,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis once roamed these lands. but later retreated due to the harsh cold spreading throughout the continent. Late European Heidelbergensis is thought to be the ancestor of Neanderthals, as some species have been found with Neanderthal-like features. These times are long gone, but temperatures still fluctuate over the next 50,000 years, and by 350,000 years ago, Neanderthals had retreated out of Britain. Neanderthals were able to thrive throughout large parts of Asia and Europe during tough environmental changes. Neanderthal remains have been found as far east as Denisova Cave in Russia, as far south as Israel, and southern Spain. Neanderthals were able to thrive in so many different environments because of their remarkable adaptations. Neanderthals had broad torsos and shortened limbs compared to other hominins, which granted a relatively high body volume with a lower surface area. This maximizes heat production and minimalizes heat loss. Their tall, broad, and generally large noses were particularly well adapted to cold air, as a tall, narrow nasal passageway increases the skin's surface area inside the nose, providing greater ability to warm and moisten cold, dry air typical of cold climates. Neanderthals had large, stocky skeletons, hinting at an impressively large amount of muscle. Muscle produces more heat than fatty tissue, but it also takes up more energy. That's where diet is factored in. Given Neanderthals' muscled frames, they likely had much higher metabolisms than other hominins. This demanded calories. A great source of calories is large-bodied game, deer, ibex, wild boar, and occasionally mammoths and woolly rhinos. All this protein consumption likely boosted their metabolisms even more, thus making their bodies produce more heat. You're probably wondering, if Neanderthals were adapted for the cold, why do we find them in warmer places like the Mediterranean and Gibraltar? During the Ice Age, the temperatures in Europe fluctuated. Like I mentioned earlier, ice was constantly spreading and retreating north over the course of the Ice Age, and although Neanderthals were more suited to colder climates than Homo sapiens, they couldn't survive in polar environments, which is exactly what Europe turned into when the ice sheets would spread from the north. When the ice sheets would spread, the Neanderthals would retreat south to the Mediterranean and southern Spain. Once the ice had retreated back up north, the Neanderthals would reclaim their old territory. And with these migrations, the Neanderthals were able to adjust their behavior to fit the circumstance. During cold glacial periods, they focused on hunting reindeer, which are cold-adapted animals. During warmer interglacial periods, they hunted red deer. It is likely that these migrations south is what resulted in the first encounters with Homo sapiens, resulting in trade, fighting, and crossbreeding. More on that later. The archaeological record is rich in Neanderthals' morphological and physiological adaptations, but their behavioural adaptations are more of a mystery. We know that Neanderthals made clothing, but scarce evidence of it has survived over the millennia. We also know that they often used caves for shelters and built fire for warmth and cooking. Finds like the eagle talons in Croatia and the evidence of pigment use in Spain give us small glimpses into Neanderthal culture. I won't go into too much detail here, as I've already covered Neanderthal art and technology in these two videos here, so if you want, give them a watch after this video. A very important part of culture is language and the exchange of information. It's very difficult to determine whether Neanderthals had spoken language, as the tissue associated with the voice box doesn't preserve. However, they did have a similar vocal anatomy, and their ear bones suggest they had a similar range of hearing to us. The evidence of how complex their social lives were also suggests that they may have been able to talk to each other, although their language may have been much more simple than ours. I can't help but find myself wondering, did Neanderthal language have an effect on our own, and did it help influence the languages that have been spoken through history? A young Neanderthal would have been born into a wild world teeming with life. The world at the time would have been very familiar to our own, yet so different. Filled with wildlife that are the ancestors of many animals in today's world. Many animals that are alive in Eurasia today existed alongside Neanderthals. Brown bears, elk, wolves, modern birds, deer, horses, and European bison. Animals that live elsewhere in the world today would have also lived alongside Neanderthals, like hyenas and lions. But perhaps the most fascinating animals to live alongside Neanderthals are the now extinct Ice Age megafauna. The world at this time was dominated by megafauna, especially compared to the modern world, where Africa is the only continent that managed to hold on to many of these magnificent animals. The megafauna that is now extinct that also would have lived alongside Neanderthals are mammoths, multiple species of elephants and saber-toothed cats, woolly rhinos, cave bears, and the Irish elk. Many of these animals would have been very dangerous to live alongside, yet alone hunt. Neanderthals seem to have hunted mostly large game, but they are also known to have hunted smaller game such as birds, rodents, and even fish. The reality is that Neanderthal diets would have been dictated by their surroundings. For example, the Neanderthals that lived in the coastal cave in Portugal were feeding regularly on fish, whereas evidence in Germany shows that Neanderthals adapted to hunt giant elephants called Paleoloxodon antiquus. With sharp stone tools, they harvested up to 4 tons of flesh from each elephant carcass. The degree of organisation required to carry out such butchery and the sheer quantity of food it provided suggests Neanderthals could form much larger social groups than previously thought. The find comes from a trove of animal bones and stone tools uncovered in the 1980s by coal miners near the town of Neumark Nord. Beginning in 1985, archaeologists spent a decade observing the mining work, recovering animal bones and stone tools from a sprawling site. Dating to a relatively warm period in Europe known as the Eemian Interglacial, 75,000 years before modern humans arrived in Western Europe, the discoveries include the bones and tusks of more than 70, mostly adult male, straight-tusked elephants. Most of the bones had been left in dozens of piles along the ancient lakeshore over the course of about 300 years. But what's most amazing about these bones is that when they were studied under a microscope, almost every single bone showed signs of butchery. Gouges and scratches on nearly every bone show the hunters were thorough. The bones hadn't been gnawed by scavengers like wolves or hyenas, suggesting nothing was left for them. In the past, Neanderthals were thought to live in small, highly mobile groups of about 20 individuals at most. But the hunting of these elephants suggests a far bigger group. The researchers determined the elephants had been hunted and not just scavenged because of the age and sex profile of the remains found in the quarry. Most of them were males, and there were few young or old ones. Adult male elephants would have been easier to hunt than females, who tend to move in herds protecting their young. Whereas adult males are solitary animals most of the time, so they are easier to immobilize, driving them into mud and pit traps. Other finds at the site suggested Neanderthals hunted a wide array of animals across a lake landscape populated by wild horses, fallow deer, and red deer. From fish to elephants, horses to bears and lions, anything was on the menu for Neanderthals. Evidence like this fragmented spearhead found embedded in a wild ass in Syria show that Neanderthals hunted by either throwing or stabbing their prey with spears. Other evidence, like this 6-year-old fallow deer skeleton from Germany, show that Neanderthals had thrusted a spear into the deer's pelvis, leaving an 11mm circular wound in the bone. The truth is, Neanderthals would have changed their hunting techniques depending on the prey. For example, evidence suggested that Neanderthals would have used fire at night to scare choughs deeper into the cave where they roosted, until they reached a dead end and were caught by either hand or nets. Neanderthals also killed cave bears as they woke up from hibernation, waiting outside the cave to ambush the bear and then skinning, eating and stealing its cave. Despite their ability to adapt and hunt most animals in their environment, there were still risks that a Neanderthal could suffer crippling injuries. Life was hard for most animals in Eurasia during the Ice Age, and that goes for Neanderthals too. The precious remains of our ancient human relatives reveal crushed limbs, fractured skulls, and broken ribs. One specimen that lived a long and painful life was Shanidar I, nicknamed Nandi. Nandi lived in a cave that sits in the Zagros Mountains in Iraq. The early years of life were rough for Nandi. He suffered a blow to the side of the head at a very young age. The blow damaged the left eye, most certainly blinding him. The blow also damaged the area of the brain controlling the right side of his body, leading to a withered right arm and possibly paralysis that also crippled his right leg. Nandi also seemed to be missing his forearm. The pointed angle on the end of the arm has led researchers to speculate that Nandi's right forearm was amputated. If that wasn't enough, Nandi also suffered another blow to the top of the skull, which could have led to his bony growths in both ears, which would have certainly caused some sort of hearing loss or complete deafness. Despite all these injuries, Nandi also suffered damage to his toes where a healed fracture can be seen, and injuries to his leg and knees which would have caused some sort of limp. So how did this man, against all odds, survive? Researchers at the site predict that Nandi was between 35 and 45 years old when he died, and most of these injuries had partly healed. Nandi survived because his group cared for him, nursing him back to health slowly but surely. Without any sort of healthcare or support from his group, Nandi would have most certainly died. Once Nandi was nursed back to health, he could hardly contribute to the group. Activities such as hunting would have been near enough impossible. Travelling to gather would have been very difficult due to his various problems with his legs, knees and feet. And he was hardly a good lookout at camp, with him being partly blind in one eye and near enough deaf in both ears. There is no clear reason why Nandi would have been kept alive by his group. In many animals and even some Homo sapien societies, when a tribe member is injured to the point where they can't contribute much to the group, or may even be putting the group at risk, they would be left behind or killed. But here we see a gleaming example of Neanderthal humanity, their kindness, loving each other, caring for each other, and that is why Nandi lived on. But social life wasn't all sunshine and rainbows in Neanderthal society. Neanderthals were very capable of violence between each other, but despite popular belief, there isn't much evidence to suggest they were more violent than Homo sapiens. A few Neanderthal bones have shown clear signs of fighting between each other. Whether this is infighting between tribe members or fighting other tribe members over territory or resources, we will never know. But what we do know is that these fights would have involved tools, and Nandi's blow to the top of the skull may have been a result of this. This infighting may have had a particular motive, especially when times were tough and food was low. 2 adults, 2 adolescents and 2 children were found in a small cave at Barma-Malagusi in the Rhône Valley in southern France. The bones bear many of the hallmarks of cannibalism: cut marks made by stone tools, complete dismemberment of the individuals, and finger bones that look as if they've been gnawed on by Neanderthal teeth, rather than by other carnivores. This isn't the only evidence of cannibalism amongst Neanderthals either. Remains from other sites in Croatia, Spain, and Belgium also show evidence of cannibalism. But in each case, there has been a lack of evidence to answer the question of why the Neanderthals engaged in this practice. Was it ritualistic, traditional, or an act of desperation when times were tough? We may never know, but all are certainly possible. Thankfully for Nandi, parts of his meals didn't consist of his own people like the Neanderthals in France. The majority of animal remains from the cave are made up of wild goats who still live in the mountainous area today. The Neanderthals at Shandar didn't just eat meat. Dental analysis of the plaque from one member of Nandi's tribe show they ate wild seeds, lentils, nuts, and legumes. Maybe here Nandi could have helped, picking these tiny seeds that grew locally to the cave. At some point, maybe while foraging for these little seeds, Nandi's group would have undoubtedly interacted with other human groups, mostly Neanderthals. These other groups of Neanderthals would bring and share their culture and ways of life. Perhaps they would have even met one of the elephant hunting groups that lived in Germany, migrating down south due to the bitter cold. But not all these groups would have been Neanderthals. Some would have been most peculiar. Nandi lived around the time Homo sapiens started entering Europe, and he lived exactly on the path some of the groups would have migrated through. This undoubtedly means that at some point in his life, Nandi's group would have encountered Homo sapiens. At some point in time, interactions between these species would have been peaceful. To say that interactions between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals always resulted in conflict is wrong. If this was the case, then why do we have Neanderthal DNA still in us today? Surely after a mixed child was born into a Neanderthal or Homo sapien group, they wouldn't have been successful enough to have children of their own. We know Neanderthals can be peaceful people, despite their many flaws that they share with us. Take Denny, for example, a half Neanderthal and half Denisovian girl, showing that Denisovians and Neanderthals could get on peacefully. Encounters would have happened multiple times all over Europe and Asia, and groups of Neanderthals may have run into multiple different groups of Homo sapiens, some friendly and peaceful, and some not. One of Nandi's tribe members, Shanadar III, seemed to have been violently attacked. A tiny groove on one of his ribs indicates he was probably struck in the chest. A 2009 analysis points to a modern human as the attacker. Based on the experimental stabbings of pig carcasses, a team led by Stephen Churchill of Duke University determined that the most likely weapon was some kind of dart shot from long range. Because modern humans are the only hominids known to have made projectile weapons, the researchers blamed our species for the wound. It's also possible he survived the attack. The bone showed signs of healing around something that was stuck in the groove, perhaps the tip of the dart, showing that he must have lived at least a few weeks after the incident, probably dying later from blood loss or injuries. Despite the risks and worries of conflict with other Neanderthals and species of humans, Nandi would have had to worry about other causes of death, especially because he was so impaired and vulnerable. Recently, a team of Spanish researchers used modern cases of carnivore attacks on humans to see if bite marks on Neanderthal bones bore similarities. Looking at 124 recent cases of attacks by lions, tigers, bears, leopards, and other carnivores on modern humans, they found similarities to marked bones in the fossil record during the Pleistocene between 40 and 200,000 years ago. In one case, they pinpointed the carnivorous perpetrator. Puncture marks in the skull of a young Neanderthal child unearthed in a cave in Valencia, Spain, resembled those from a modern big cat. Although predators were unlikely to hunt adult Neanderthals as prey due to Neanderthals being the apex predator, the younger and injured members of the group would have been at great risk, like the child that was killed in this study. Human children have always been at risk of predation throughout human evolution due to just how fragile they are. so we can expect Neanderthal children to fall victim to some of the predators that lived with them at the time. Thankfully for Nandi, none of his family were killed by predators, at least as far as we're aware. Nandi's life came to an unfortunate end when he likely died due to a rockfall in the cave. After a long and hard life, he now could finally lie and rest, while his tribe undoubtedly mourned his death. But Nandi's tribe didn't just mourn his death. It seems they mourned all their dead companions' deaths. Multiple signs point towards the Shanadar residents burying their dead. Multiple bodies have been found in the same locations, as if they were intentionally buried together. 2 other bodies resting in burial-like positions show evidence of plant matter that have decomposed into the dirt around both bodies. Is this evidence Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers? This has sparked a debate amongst researchers. One of the bodies also seemed to have possessed a flake stone in one of their hands. Was this placed here intentionally? We simply don't know. One thing we do know for certain is that the Shanadar cave is the home of one of the most beautiful and significant sites in the world. In this cave, we find evidence of the difficulties Neanderthals faced in their lifetime, as well as a heartwarming example of their humanity and morality, caring for loved ones, burying and mourning their dead. They truly were human. Life on our planet has such a fragile existence. Many weird and wonderful species of animals have graced our planet's surface, but failed to stand the test of time. Whether a volcanic eruption, climate change, or competition, life on our planet has seen it all. Some of these events may have drove our lineage to the end of their lives. There have been at least 8 other species of human that have lived on this planet, but now there's only us, Homo sapiens. Where did all the other humans go? This question has caused much debate amongst the scientific community, and many theories have surfaced claiming to explain these both sudden and gradual extinctions. Before we jump into the theories, we should first address the fact that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. Neanderthals are known to contribute between 1% and 4% of the genomes of non-African modern humans, and modern humans who lived about 40,000 years ago have been found to have between 6 and 9% Neanderthal DNA. Although modern Asian and European populations carry the most Neanderthal DNA, it's worth recognising that modern Africans still have a bit of Neanderthal DNA. The evidence we have of Neanderthal and modern human interbreeding sheds light on the expansion of modern humans out of Africa. For many years, the only evidence of Homo sapien and Neanderthal hybridization existed within modern human genes. However, in 2016, researchers published a new set of Neanderthal DNA sequences from Altai Cave in Siberia, as well as from Spain and Croatia, that show evidence of Homo sapien and Neanderthal interbreeding as far back as 100,000 years ago. That's farther back than many previous estimates of Homo sapien migration out of Africa. These findings are the first to show Homo sapien gene flow into the Neanderthal genome, as opposed to Neanderthal DNA into the Homo sapien genome. This data tells us that not only were Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbreeding events more frequent than previously thought, but also that an early migration of humans did in fact leave Africa before the population that gave rise to all contemporary non-African modern humans. What role Neanderthal DNA has in us today is hard to determine, but most of their morphological features have gone, completely vanished from today's world. So I think it's entirely reasonable to conclude that Neanderthals are indeed extinct and didn't just assimilate into the modern human gene pool. Some of the DNA is found in parts of the human genome that are associated with skin and hair, maybe giving our ancestors thicker hair and skin that helped them cope better with the colder climate. Neanderthal DNA in modern humans seems to also be associated with diseases such as diabetes, lupus, and Crohn's disease, which causes inflammation of the gut. A team of researchers from a number of European and American research institutions have produced detailed new studies from stalagmites that highlight changes in the European climate more than 40,000 years ago. They found several cold periods that coincide with the timings of a near-complete absence of archaeological artifacts from Neanderthals, strengthening the idea of the impact that changes in climate had on the long-term survival of these humans. Stalagmites grow in thin layers each year, and any change in temperatures alters their chemical composition. The layers therefore preserve a natural archive of climate change over many thousands of years. The researchers examined stalagmites in 2 Romanian caves, which revealed more detailed records of climate change in continental Europe than had been previously available. The layers of the stalagmites showed a series of prolonged extreme cold and excessively dry conditions in Europe between 44 and 40,000 years ago. They highlight a cycle of temperatures gradually cooling, staying very cold for centuries to millennia, and then warming again very abruptly. The researchers compared these paleoclimate records with archaeological records of Neanderthal artifacts, and found a correlation between the cold periods and an absence of Neanderthal tools. This indicates the Neanderthal population greatly reduced during cold periods, suggesting that climate change played a major role in their decline. These changes in climate could have also impacted the animals living in the Neanderthal environment, putting them at increased risk of starvation. Most megafauna survived these cold cycles, but animals like the straight-tusked elephants, which Neanderthals used to hunt, went extinct. Researchers believe that modern humans survived these cold periods because their more advanced technology, such as clothing, everyday tools, and hunting weapons, were better adapted to the environment than Neanderthals. Neanderthals' diets could be considered varied. Evidence from Gibraltar shows that when they lived in coastal areas, they exploited marine resources such as mollusks, seals, dolphins, and fish. Plaque on the remains of molar teeth also show us that Neanderthals ate a variety of plants. Despite this, it seems that Neanderthals still had a less diverse diet than modern humans, living largely on meat from the animals they had successfully pursued. These food sources would naturally become scarce during colder periods, making the Neanderthals more vulnerable to rapid environmental change. In comparison, modern humans had a diverse diet, eating more types of plants, animals, and seafood. This, coupled with their more advanced toolkit, is why researchers think that modern Homo sapiens were able to inhabit the lost colder territories that Neanderthals previously lived in. When temperatures warmed again, their smaller populations could not expand as their previous habitats had been occupied by Homo sapiens, and this facilitates a staggered expansion of modern humans into Europe. Another event that could have been the final nail in the coffin for Neanderthals was the eruption of a supervolcano called Campi Flegrei. The volcano isn't as famous as others, as the majority of it is hidden underground, mostly under the Bay of Pozzuoli. Campi Flegrei has erupted as recently as 1538, but one of its most explosive eruptions was 39,000 years ago. The ash from this eruption spread as far as Asia, and the winter that followed is believed by some researchers to have partly driven the Neanderthals to extinction. Many animals adapted to these changes and managed to survive, so why didn't Neanderthals? In a sense, the genes that were beneficial to Neanderthals during these harsh times did survive in us, but a lot didn't, and these traits may have been the ultimate demise for Neanderthals. Neanderthals had a shorter life than we do. They tended to mature quicker and die younger. In fact, there are very little remains of Neanderthals who have lived past the age of 40. This could have slowed down the advancement of technology and the passing down of knowledge. This could have also meant that it was harder for Neanderthals to raise children, as the older, unfertile members of the group were dying off sooner than elder Homo sapiens. I've previously explored the role that elder members of the tribe play when looking after children in modern hunter-gatherer tribes. Elder members take the burden off the parents and reduce stress in the group as they can help look after the tribe's kids. This reduced stress could aid in spending more time gathering and hunting for food, as well as increasing fertility. It's already thought that most Neanderthal groups were smaller than Homo sapiens, but the shorter lifespan and lower birth rates means that the tribe was in a vicious cycle of maintaining or losing their numbers. Although Neanderthal children matured quicker than we do, it's only by a few years. A 12-year-old Neanderthal child found in Gibraltar shows that they were as developed as a 16-year-old Homo sapien. This simply isn't a good trade, especially when you consider how early they die off. Modern hunter-gatherers can live well into their 80s, and this long lifespan facilitates the passing down of knowledge and the ease of burden, something that I theorize Neanderthals lacked. Another trait that could have increased the pressure on Neanderthal populations was their stocky, short bodies, which would have required between 4,000 and 6,000 calories each day. That's 2 to 3 times more than Homo sapiens, which is certainly a disadvantage when your regular prey has started to disappear and your competitors are able to thrive off less food. As a result of this, Neanderthal population and range contracted, resulting in a much smaller gene pool, and we find evidence of this in many inbred Neanderthal skeletons. Many things like a smaller gene pool could have lowered Neanderthal birth rates, but one obvious example of Neanderthals' decline in fertility is the fact that the amount of stored body fat influences fertility in women. A decline in resources caused by climate degradation or competition with modern humans may have affected fertility, mostly for young women giving birth for the first time. When you couple this with the point I previously covered on why it was difficult for Neanderthals to raise children, we can start to draw a picture in our minds on just why these amazing beings slowly vanished from the earth. The reality is, it was probably all these changes and disadvantages combined that drove Neanderthals to extinction. Picture this. There is an adult male Neanderthal living in what is now France. Times are hard. The once giant straight-tusked elephants have been slowly disappearing for the past few years, and this hunting season has been particularly fruitless. The tribe have failed to catch anything other than a dozen birds and a deer. Time seems to have run out too soon, and the cold snap of winter bites earlier than the years before. The tribe has no choice but to pack up and move south, escaping the cold spreading from the north. After waiting out the winter in what is now Spain, surviving off nuts, moss, mushrooms, and the occasional rabbit, the tribe make their way back up north. When they reach their home, they find that things have changed dramatically. Homo sapiens have now taken over the land while the Neanderthals were down south. They are no stranger to the tribe, as they have had interactions in the past. These interactions were peaceful, and the tribe enjoyed the fruits of trade with these Homo sapiens. The Neanderthal tribe are struggling. The oldest member died while in Spain at the age of 42. Perhaps the sudden disappearance of fatty meat in her diet caused her to grow weak. The tribe was ill prepared for this migration. The numbers in the group have slowly dwindled over the past few years, with some abandoning the tribe to find better luck elsewhere. In an act of desperation, the Neanderthal male approaches the Homo sapien tribe. With very little talk between the two species, they manage to communicate, albeit very vague. The Homo sapiens see that the Neanderthals are struggling and invite them into the tribe with open arms. The Neanderthal tribe are very lucky. Similar interactions have happened all over Europe, and very few of the Homo sapien tribes were so inviting and loving. The Neanderthals are now part of the tribe, and they can live out the rest of their days learning and sharing ideas with the Homo sapiens. In a few hundred years' time, these Neanderthals would have been completely absorbed into the Homo sapien gene pool. All their physical traits would have vanished. The Neanderthals in Asia and Europe have now disappeared. The last surviving groups of Neanderthals died out in southern Spain, leaving their story to be pieced together by us tens of thousands of years later. This story is of course entirely speculation, but I think it's a good idea to try and paint a picture of what life may have been like for a Neanderthal family in their final days.